Most likely you are exposing your images totally wrong. In this video I will tell you why, and I will tell you how to fix it so that you can get the correct exposure the correct way. Hi there, I'm Peter Forsgård, an Olympus visionary and a professional photographer from Helsinki, Finland. And before we get into the metering modes and the exposure compensation, please consider subscribing to my channel and hit that bell so you get notified when there is a new video online. My channel is all about you getting to be a better photographer and of course about Olympus gear. And remember, I post 2 videos a week. But let's start talk about the metering modes and the exposure compensation. First I want to explain you what the metering modes are and how the camera actually makes the exposure values. Usually you have 3 different metering modes to choose from. The first one is usually called matrix, and on Olympus it's called ESP, and in Olympus cameras it will detect 322 different zones in the image area and calculate an average exposure. And then you have the center weight, which will give more weight to the center of the frame. So if you have your subject in the center, this could be the one that you can choose. And then you have spot metering. This varies a bit from different cameras. Some might have spot highlight, spot low light, or then you might have several different angles of view that the spot metering will cover. In Olympus cameras it's 2%. The different metering modes were a really good invention in the film era. But in the modern mirrorless world, there's no use for metering modes. Let me explain. The light meter in your camera only gives you an average value for the exposure. The camera thinks that everything is mid-gray. And here is an example. I have a constant light here and a white piece of paper. When I try to make a decent exposure for this image, all the pixels in the histogram are right in the middle. And the middle is gray. On the right hand side is white and on the left hand side is the black. So why is everything in the middle if this is white? Well, if you take a picture like this, and here you can see the image. Is this white? Well, no, it's not. It's gray. No exposure compensation. This is what the light meter told me, and this is how the camera would treat the white paper when it exposes it. And the same thing with black. If I have a black piece of paper, the same thing happens. It will look gray in an image, as you can see here. So how can we trust a device that thinks that black and white is the same color, a mid-gray color? Well, we cannot, and I will tell you how to fix that. Well, of course, I need to take a bit back. Of course, modern cameras are a bit smarter than that. If you have both colors in your image, as you can see here, you have the blacks on this side and the whites on this side. But when I move the camera, you can see that the exposure changes, and so is the histogram, of course, changing. But why is the exposure changing when the light is constant? It is because it tries to make the black wider and the white darker, as we saw in the previous example. And that's why we cannot trust the light meter on your camera. And this is also the reason that metering modes don't matter at all. They're totally useless, in my opinion. But how did we cope with this in the film era when we could not see the exposure like we can nowadays with modern cameras? And what we did was exposure bracketing. So we took the same scene with different exposures just in case. And remember, back in the film days, especially if you used slide film, you could find out if your exposure was correct a week after you took the images. So we've come a long way. But of course with the digital camera we can also bracket if we want, but we don't need to. There's a better way. Well, what is it? We can use histogram, zebras or flag colors. And actually we don't need to worry about the exposure values at all. Of course, we need to think about what the shutter speed does to motion and what aperture does with the depth of field. But other than that, there is no need to worry about what the exposure values actually are, as long as your image is exposed correctly. You need to set up your camera so that you can see the histogram in the viewfinder, or you can see the zebras there, or you can see the flag colors. Some cameras don't have zebras and flag colors, some have only zebras and some have only flag colors. So it depends on your camera brand which way to use it. But what about DSLRs? You don't see the histogram in most cases in the viewfinder, in the optical viewfinder. So what you need to do is either use the old way like we did in the film days to bracket, or then you need to chimp after every image you take. And I think the way the mirrorless can handle this situation is a lot better. And that's why I always say that mirrorless is the modern camera and the future, because it's just better. And with the DSLRs, a lot of people do that, they underexpose just in case, a stop or two. But what happens is that you need to increase your exposure in post, and that will in most cases introduce some noise to your images, and you lose a lot of image quality. And if you have a full frame DSLR, you will lose the advantage over mirrorless cameras, or micro four thirds cameras in this case. But let's get back to mirrorless and the exposure compensation. As I said, when metering the exposure, the camera will give you an average value, which is correct exposure as the camera sees it. But it's not necessarily the exact and the best exposure that will give you the best image quality. It is only a starting point. What you need to do in most cases, either lower the exposure or increase the exposure. So you go to the plus side or to the minus side on the exposure compensation values. The goal is to try to get the histogram as far right as possible. This is the way to get the best out of your image quality, because there is more information in the bright side of the histogram than there is on the dark side of the histogram. That's the way image recording with the digital sensor works. That's why we need to have the histogram as far right as possible. What I'm saying that we need to rethink the way we expose our images, and we need to throw away the old way of relying on the light meter and guessing the exposure. And as I said, also the metering modes are totally useless. But of course, in some cases, those might give you a bit better starting point. For example, if we take a picture of the moon, what makes it easier is if you use the spot meter. You have the spot meter on the moon because it's quite bright, and then you have a better starting point. But you can use any of the metering modes and you still will get the same result by exposure compensation. So, as I said, metering modes are in most cases totally useless. And you might want to watch these videos next. The first one is how to correctly expose your images to the right with Olympus and how to set it up so that you get the perfect exposure with raw images. And the second one is also about correct exposure. But hey, thanks for watching and bye for now.